I don't want to leave Ratius hanging either. So let me clone. What is this using? Is it using bun? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I think I already have bun in this shell, but whatever. Bun. Okay. You people and your lack of flakes. Okay. Let's take a look in here. Runtime. There's a lot in here. Maybe we could start with managed runtime. Let's see. So it looks like okay, hang on.
So we have some singletons. It seems that they are created when configure runtime is called, right?
It looks like it. I think one thing I would try to without okay, take these comments as I haven't looked at anything else yet, but one thing that I think is better than having a global layer is instead potentially having a global memo map. So like here right now we have some singletons in the project that are just like global, which is fine. I'm sure for certain runtimes this is fine. But I think that one alternative approach you could think about, and I don't know enough about the project to really say this is the right approach, but one alternative you could do is instead of having the layer be the global thing, you could use layer.memomap. Oh. So MemoMap is the thing under the hood that memoizes services as they're built. So right now, I don't know enough about this to make an assertion, but every time that this layer is used in the Svelte application, if it's not explicitly cached, every time it's used by an effect.provide or similar, all of these dependencies would get rebuilt. And again, I haven't looked at anything else, but just looking at this, whenever we use this layer, it would be rebuilt, which would mean all of the logic to build the services in this layer would be rebuilt. Instead, if you have a global memo map, so global memo map, right? One strategy you could use is that the first time you actually build the thing, you give it this memo map, and then every other time that you need to use the layer, or every other time the layer attempts to be built, as long as you're using the same memo map, everything would be cached. But maybe we could take a look at the managed runtime first and see how this is being used. Where's the managed runtime made?
I think it was initially in the first lines. Oh no, sorry, that was only the
Managed runtime.make.
there it is.
Managed runtime.make preserves the layer's provided services. This adapter only exposes the runtime through already provided effects. Yeah, so like for example, managed runtime.make takes a second options object where you can pass in a memo map. So like right now, you're doing a lot of manual work to lock runtime configuration, which I'm assuming is like a flag or something similar. Yeah, that makes it so that don't can use this again or whatever. Instead, if you like this becomes sort of unnecessary if you're passing a memo map in here that's global. So if you have a global memo map, then it doesn't really matter you call uh, every time you call this manage runtime.make or whatever, it's not really doing additional work. The layer is only going to be all the services are going to be cached. And then you can have methods like if you need to be able to reset the runtime, for example, you can have methods that reset the memo map instead. So it can clean up a lot of this like global state management that you're doing here with runtime configuration. I wasn't aware of MemoMap. Yeah, so under the hood, okay, for those that are not aware of MemoMap, maybe we could take a 5-second detour. Layer.
4, 3, 2, 1.
We always take more than a 5-second detour. Who am I kidding? So a MemoMap is used to memoize layer construction and ensure that layers can be shared cleanly. It prevents duplicate construction of the same layer instances, enabling efficient resource sharing across dependencies. Clearly, this was AI generated. Basically, all it does is it caches a service once it's built during layer construction. So a service the layer graph's being evaluated, right? Actually, we can, I wish I could like TL draw on top of this, but I can't. You could imagine a service is being evaluated in the layer graph. Service is built. Or the first thing that happens is the layer graph builder thingy checks if the context tag or context service, if the identifier is in the map already. And if it's in the map already, it's just immediately returned from the memo map. So that's what this get or else memoize thing does. It gets a layer in, a scope, and then a build method. And basically, as the layer graph is being traversed, we check in the memo map if the service identifier already exists. And if it does, that service can be returned immediately. Otherwise, then we build the service, we put it in the memo map, and we continue. So you can see here a kind of an example of it. Build a memo map, get a scope, we create a layer, and then we get a context object back by building the layer graph. In this case, there's only one service in the graph, but whatever, you could pass any layer in here. And once this service is built, so once this object is returned from whatever goes on in build, it'll be put in the memo map, and the associated context would be returned. And so memo maps are the thing. It's the thing that allows caching services to work well. Does effect provide context or provide service add to the layer memo map or not? No, because you're not using layers in that case. There is no, well, that's not true. There is a global memo map now in Effect v4, but provide context and provide service unless Tim changed something. Somebody's gonna like look at the code and be like, Max, you're wrong.
Actually.
Actually, Max, let me push his glasses up on nose. Actually, oh my god, these signatures. One moment, folks. Just gotta scroll through all the overloads. Here we go.
There you go.
Provide service. Impl. Update context. Yeah, no, see. Provide service and provide service effect, provide context. They update the context. They don't have anything to do with layers or memo maps. So the memo map is important when you're actually building a layer, because you can imagine a layer as a graph of dependencies, right? You have a graph, and the same service could exist at multiple points in the graph. And the whole point when you build a layer is to return a context, which your effect can then like use to access services, right? So as the build method is traversing the layer graph, it keeps a memo map so that if it sees the same service multiple times, it doesn't have to rebuild that service. But once the layer is built, we don't there is no concept of a memo map outside of that. A memo map exists to facilitate memoization while building layers. So I guess all that to answer the question of the provide service and provide context do not.
One could
Uh,
one could say, as the signature we have seen before, that layers plus MemoMap equals the context. One
yeah,
could think
that's a
about
good.
that. Yeah, plus scope. Yeah, because when you need to provide a lifetime for the layers that you are going to create, provides a context of a service. Yeah, that's my mental model. I would say.
Yeah, so when you call effect.provide, essentially what goes on under the hood is we create a memo map, we create a scope, and then we start traversing the layer graph, building services, adding them to the memo map. If they need a scope, we give the scope, right? And so that's what build is doing. And then at the very end, everything as they're built is being added to the memo map and also being added to a context object. And at the very end, we get back our context with all our services in it. So uh, effect.provide does create a new memo map. Hence, you are supposed to create a layer once and provide it in one go. Yeah, in effect v4, we sort of let you cheat. We try to prevent the foot gun because in effect v4, effect.provide, oh god, oh my god, all the signatures. Provide layer.
There it is.
So here, when you actually finally get to the place where the layer starts to be built, we have added the ability to, so under the hood, unless you specifically disable it, a memo map is shared now in effect v4 between provides. So build with scope here, we go look at it. You'll notice we still call build with memo map, but this current memo map reference gets propagated between provides. So in effect v4, we tried to remove the foot gun of doing this like multiple times in a row. So now if you do this and you build your layers, like it'll still all get added. Like the foot gun is no longer present, but we still advise against this. Still not a good pattern to do this. It's better to compose your layer graph and then provide it once. And you can also explicitly disable the sharing by passing local true, which means that this layer should be built like local and not like shared. But anyway, that's what a memo map is. And the layer map.service, that's more for like managing layer selection within a service. Yeah, that's not layer map.service. Like obviously once you extract the layer, it needs to be built with a memo map, etc., etc. And I think layer map under the hood
Yeah,
uses an reference
yeah, a ref
reference
counted
counting.
map. Yeah, I think it's a ref counted map, and then it chooses based on that.
When your layer graph hits a layer with fresh, it does not pass the current memo map into that subtree graph, right? Yeah, fresh bypasses the memo map. So if you annotate your layer with layer.fresh, that means you want a fresh layer. That means don't use the cached version. It means don't access the memoized service. So if you have a layer.fresh my layer inside the layer graph, like this would be rebuilt. even if my layer was somewhere else, like if you did my layer dot pipe,
That would
if
be
you had
twice.
this would build my layer twice. But if you do this would build my layer once. So layer.fresh is a way to specifically say you want a fresh layer. I have no idea what we were talking about before this, but
We were looking at the thing saying that probably instead of holding a local global layer, it would be more interesting to hold a global memo map, and so that you could
yeah.
provide that when you make your runtime.
Yeah, and again, you can like you probably by doing that would get rid of a lot of this boilerplate.
Mm.
I don't know the internals of Svelte. I don't know if there were decisions made here specifically because of that. Um, but me being just naive about Svelte and like just looking at this with a fresh set of eyes, that's like one of the first things I would probably consider is can I leverage MemoMap here to get rid of some of all of this like boilerplate stuff? Is using the context to tunnel an XSLT reference for passing parameters to places where you don't know it's going to be used. For example, parsing an account ID of a customer, adding it to a context, and using it somewhere in effect by yielding it. Yeah, I mean, you can use context, an effect context to avoid. I'll use a React term, prop passing, right? You can use it to avoid passing things as parameters if you know you're going to need a value like 10 effects deep in your like call stack, then you can add it to the context of the parent effect or the grandparent effect or the great grandparent effect, and that will be available to all the children of said effect. Any effect. I hesitate to use the term parent child because that's not really like what an effect is, but um, I think it's useful conceptually. Like if you could imagine, this is my parent effect. Mike would yell at me for using this particular terminology, but you can imagine this gen as your parent effect. If you have like a right, like we have a parent effect and a child effect. If we do something like a pipe effect dot provide service by service, then this child effect could yield my service, and it would also be type safe. So it's type safe that like if you were to look at child effect, it would show if I actually imported effect and did this properly, it would show up in the requirements. So yeah, if you've provided something to an effect, it's available in any effects that set effect like depends on anything that's yielded in a generator. Yeah.
Also, one thing that I would also add is something that you can also take advantage of yielding services by using like the effect service optional to have also a way to propagate something that sometimes you may have, as sometimes you may have not. Classic example being like you have a database connection that you may want, but you have the same API that sometimes works under a transaction, and you can define the transaction as its own separate service. And then you may have API that only depends on the database connection, for example. And what they will do first is check the by using a service option, check if the transaction service is in there, and if the transaction service is in there, it will use that, and you perform the query over the transaction. And if it's not there, it will use the regular connection client that I have. And that's kind of the same reason that's behind the scene of how like context reference works.
I feel like somebody asked me a question in chat and maybe it got removed for some reason because YouTube chat is weird, about why Mike doesn't like the parent child mental model. Maybe it's still there and I just can't see it. Um, but I think it's because, like, yes, an effect is in theory, you have like outer and inner like effects, but they're at the end of the day, once you run that program, it's all composed as a single effect. That's in stark contrast to fibers, right, which actually do the running of the effect, where you do have like an explicit parent-child relationship. With effects themselves, there is no like parent-child relationship. You just have uh, an
Units of
effect
work.
and then
Mm,
another
mm.
effect that runs after that effect and whatever. Like there's no everything is composed into a single program. There is no parent-child relationship aside from like, if it's a useful mental model, for sure use it. But that's I think I don't want to say Mike doesn't like the mental model, but I know that he prefers to be more precise with how you think about that type of thing. So anyway, let's stop putting words in Mike's mouth and
You're gonna
look.
be clipped,
And
you know.
I'm gonna be clipped. I'm gonna be clipped, and then Mike is gonna message me, and he's gonna say, "Why are you putting words in my mouth?" Just kidding. Where should we go next? Uh, let's look at actions, maybe
Hmm.
collapsed or yeah. I mean, think of it however you want. Whatever's the most useful mental model is fine.
Hmm.
What does run with runtime do?
Oh,
Oh, I don't know.
that
Go ahead,
uh,
Mattia.
that connects to something that I was about to say before. Is that what I don't like much about that API design that you had for the runtime is that you described basically there the ability to accept layers that have unknown provided services and known provided unknown requirements. Um, Even if it's just boilerplate, I would have preferred something like you have a make function that takes the type parameters of the service that you expect your application to work with in the global runtime, and then export a constant instantiation of that make function. Because again, in here, by basically having that unknown, you are basically losing the ability of being sure that when you call this with run with runtime, you're actually like using services that are actually provided or by the runtime. Whereas if you have defined that as something that actually types the services that your runtime can provide, that would have been more type safe. And again, that does not mean that you lose the ability of being able to configure what the service could be, because again, as I said, you those would be type parameters of those make function. But at least I think it would have given like more type safety. Again, I don't know if this decision comes from some Svelte related decision, but that's what I would say in order to have something that's more type safe.
I agree with that as well. Um, yeah, I'm not. I'm
Mm,
there's a code smell here.
mm.
Um, like there's really no reason to have this be unknown. Just do this.
Yeah, yeah. The gist
Like
would be that you have to be sure that that R parameter that you provide is something that you have actually injected in the runtime created by get or create runtime.
right. That's why
So
like I
that's what.
almost think you were arguing for this, Mattia.
Yeah, that's why I would have something like a function that it's called make global runtime, something like that, that would have like the type parameters of the services that are involved, and then you export a single instantiation of export const make global runtime providing in the services, because that would have mean that that make function can return back to you this run with runtime function, and that function can specifically type for you which are the requirements that are allowed uh, in the dependency channel for those effects.
Yeah, agree, 100%. Also here, you could consider, I don't know if in Svelte you have to throw or not, um, but you could consider working with, like, making this more aware of the error type, or you could like erase it entirely and force folks to handle the errors in their
Mhm.
effects. But like right now, there's literally nothing you can do. If an error leaks into this effect and it's thrown, it's gonna get thrown, which is not a super great experience. So, um, like,
Unless there is some Svelte thing that does it for you when a
right,
thrown promise is detected, for example.
yeah, there's a couple of things you could do here. You could have like a an on error,
Yeah.
or you could even have an options object that has an on error that you pass into like the catch block here. Um, or you could make this a promise of an exit,
Mm.
right? Like there's a couple of ways you can go about this, but definitely would agree with Mattia that the types should be tightened up a bit here. Let me see. Let's look at like a server handler. I don't know what any of this does. Let's see. An
Um,
effect candidate. What's an effect
oh.
candidate? Feels so
Uh,
official.
that I don't like.
Yeah,
A
I think
or
specifically um the requirements channel. Like we're losing track of so many types here.
mm.
Uh,
Also disambiguating between A and an effect of A. Well, and given that you return a promise of A, it could work. I would just be very careful where you call that run candidate.
Yeah, I think at runtime this check is fine, but I agree like the types here could certainly use a bit of cleaning up. I think like propagating the error in requirements is worthwhile, even if you default them to never.
Mm.
Like at least then they could be used elsewhere in here, right? Like if you wanted to have them show up in the return signature or something, or if you wanted to
Let's say that you return a
exp
promise, for example, instead of A, so that you can like infer the error of that exit. That sorry, return a promise of exit. You can infer then the E type of the exit in that case.
exactly. Or even like if you wanted to have handlers in here, like
Mm,
we were talking about before.
yeah.
But I think in general, a lot of these types need to be tightened up in it. Man, I wish I knew some Svelte because I have no idea what's going on. Let me look at the README. It is a runtime only adapter for using Effect and sveltekit server APIs. Okay. Import the wrapper that matches the sveltekit server surface you are using. Okay,
Mhm.
let's look here. So we have an effect, and we have a wrap handler. Wrap handler, effect.succeed, new response. Okay. Does
Mhm.
wrap handler enforce you return a response?
Yeah, promise over a response. It says, but
I
hmm,
don't see a return type being
hmm,
annotated anywhere.
no,
Does run candidate enforce that? No.
no. Handler source maybe.
That's handler source.
On the right as a parameter. I don't know if maybe that is enforcing. Yeah, there you go. An effect candidate or a response or a promise of an effect candidate.
Got it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, that's the smell that we were talking before. Because if effect candidate is A or an effect of A, promise of an effect candidate over a response means that you can pass in here a promise of an effect of response, right?
Promise effect on response. Yeah. Yes. In theory, you could do that. Yes.
Yeah,
So you could end up with something like this: promise,
effect or response. Yeah.
which I don't know if your runtime can handle.
No, because it was checking if it was an effect. In this case, it was a promise.
Yeah. I think I would lean into, if you're gonna make, if this is an effect runtime, I would just lean into the effects, right? Like just lean into effect if that's the purpose of this library. Don't try to do too much.
Mhm. Or at least I would try to disambiguate with something like an exit or an effect.
Or have
Something that,
separate methods. Wrap
oh
handler,
yeah,
wrap
or
handler
that's
effect.
yeah.
Right? Like but again, like with, if you're wrapping a synchronous A, like, do you need this effect runtime? Probably not.
Yeah.
For app-wide configuration, call configure runtime once and hooks. Usually rewrap init.
And that leans again back to what I was saying before, that probably that's something that you want your user, instead of calling a configure runtime from your library, probably you want the user to call something like make runtime from your library, and then in the user app leaves the singleton, I would say. So that's typed with the services that the user decides to inject
Even
in the
further,
runtime.
like you could make this wrap init. I don't know what wrap init does, but you could refactor this so that um wrap init builds a, or configure runtime builds a memo map behind the scenes that your managed runtime consumes, right? Like if that's all, if wrap init or init can be asynchronous, then you can just build the layers as part of this, construct the memo map, the global memo map, and then your runtime can just consume that instead of all of these other things. I think that that's like, before, without diving too much further into this, I think those are some like very concrete initial directions, I would
Mhm.
say. The types need to be cleaned up because there's much too much mixing, like Matthias said, of promise, effect, or synchronous values. My preference would be, if this is an effect library, just lean into effect.
Mm.
Um, and I think uh, I would look into whether or not constructing a memo map makes sense. Because again, like you could have um, configure runtime could accept a layer instead
Yeah,
of all these options, right? It could just be like a layer that you pass in here, which gets
yeah.
built and provided, and then the corresponding memo map gets consumed.
And that, I would say that that's exactly the point where maybe if these hooks.server.ts could be the same point that exports those type safe methods for running effects that you pass
Yeah.
in the layer, so you can infer the types of the services from the layer you pass in for configuring the runtime, and then you can return back an object with those run methods.
You can even have the same options object here, which like maybe sets up like common effect services like it is
Mhm.
here, like logging and stuff. Um, and then the corresponding memo map gets used. The other thing that I'm like, this might be a svelte thing, but I'm not sure, is if you're using a managed runtime, and I don't know, but if you're using a managed runtime already, some of this stuff may not even be necessary, because a managed runtime will only build the configured layer once, and then it will be cached. Like you'll get the same every time you. Sorry, constructing the managed runtime is one thing, but then like every time you use it, it just the built layer is
Reuses.
cached.
Yeah.
So I'm, maybe rethink whether or not this whole runtime dance is even necessary. I don't know. Again, like without looking further into this, I don't know, but Um, yeah, just some
Yeah.
feedback. Um, I want to see some examples of what it looks like to build and provide layers dynamically during a program versus the newbie approach of building and providing layers for just your top level program's effect. It's not the newbie approach, it's the correct approach.
Yeah. I would say that providing layers dynamically means like injecting different services dynamically. It's bad, I would say. It's different thing injecting a dynamic instance of a service. That's another thing, and that's fine. Injecting dynamic services in the sense that you can inject a user repo, a project's repo, or like whatever service at runtime without knowing at compile time what's necessary and what could be in there, I would say that's bad.
Plus, I would almost argue that the newbie approach is providing layers dynamically, right? Like if you want to provide something dynamically in an effect program, most of the time I would lean into either provide service or provide context because you really don't want to be building a layer as part of your effect program. The whole point of layers is that you can define your services up front at the initial at application initialization, like when the app is starting up. Like if you build if you have layers that are constructed dynamically, you're doing a lot of work for nothing, and it's also not really going to do what you want, right? Because the scope, for example, like the scope that's associated with that constructed service, it becomes hard to reason about. Like the scope gets attached to the calling effect, which then has to deal with that scope. Like when do you close that service? It's I think if you're building layers dynamically, then that's when you would be considering like a layer map situation.
Mm,
Because the only time where you should be building layers dynamically, in my opinion, is if you want multiple instances of the same service in your program. Otherwise, like I think the correct and like, approach with layers is to build them up front. Um, anyway, meant more so injecting a variant of a service. Yeah, then I would use provide
mm,
service or provide context
yeah.
to do that.